Others referred to her simply as the woman who anticipated shortages before they occurred. Eventually, a senior captain traced the improvements back to Lyra's calculations and reported upward, unaware of the broader implications. When news reached Calum that an Omega of noble blood was present near active combat zones, his initial reaction was controlled anger. An Omega's presence so close to conflict risked distraction. It risked vulnerability. It risked precisely the instability Draxmore sought to exploit. He interpreted her arrival as recklessness cloaked in idealism. The battlefield was not a forum for symbolic defiance. It was a domain of precision and restraint. Yet as reports accumulated detailing how revised supply routes had prevented collapse along the southern flank, his certainty wavered. Hundreds of soldiers remained operational because medical aid had reached them in time. The strategist responsible was the very Omega he believed should have remained behind palace walls. Before Calum could summon her formally, Draxmore launched a calculated disruption. The attack was not defined by brute force but by atmosphere, a strange compound carried on the wind unsettled alpha instincts, distorting sensory perception and heightening disorientation. Orders were misheard, signals delayed. The cohesion that defined Arendale's military began to fracture under confusion. For the first time since the campaign began, uncertainty rippled through the ranks. From her position within the supply corridor, Lyra observed the shift not as panic, but as pattern. She noticed how enemy movements synchronized with gusts of manipulated wind, how flanking units advanced precisely when Alpha commanders hesitated. The strategy was not random, it was engineered to exploit instinctual hierarchy. Alphas relied on heightened senses for rapid coordination, and Draxmore had found a way to blur that advantage without open confrontation. Lyra understood then that the rumors circulating in the capital had been true. This was psychological warfare designed to erode confidence. Instead of retreating to safety as confusion spread, Lyra moved forward. She navigated between communication posts, recalculating enemy trajectory based on visible terrain shifts rather than disrupted signals. Through careful observation, she identified a concealed maneuver unfolding along the eastern ridge, a flanking advancement masked by sensory interference. If left unchecked, it would isolate Calum's command position and fracture the defensive line. Determined to deliver this analysis directly, Lyra ascended toward the command ridge. Ash streaked her cloak, and the air vibrated with tension rather than impact. Soldiers parted instinctively, recognizing urgency in her stride. When Calum finally saw her approaching through the haze, time seemed suspended. She did not appear fragile. She stood unshaken amid collapsing coordination, her expression focused rather than fearful. In that moment, he understood that her presence was not a liability, but an anomaly the battlefield had not accounted for. She reached the outer perimeter of the ridge, prepared to relay the critical insight that could stabilize the line. Around them, officers struggled to recalibrate under distorted perception. Calum's gaze locked with hers, recognition and realization colliding in silent exchange. The Omega the kingdom had tried to shield now stood at the epicenter of its most volatile hour. As Lyra stepped forward to deliver the warning that could redirect the course of battle, unseen eyes observed from a distant vantage point. Hidden beyond the fractured tree line, a Draxmore marksman adjusted his scope with calculated patience. In the suspended heartbeat before consequence, the air itself seemed to tighten, and as Lyra opened her mouth to reveal the hidden flanking maneuver, a single distant click echoed across the ridge. And time itself seemed to fracture. A single bullet shattered more than flesh. It tore through tradition, power, and the unspoken laws of an empire. The sharp crack that split the air did not sound extraordinary at first. It was simply another distant report swallowed by the chaos of disrupted signals and shifting formations. Yet in the span of a breath, everything changed. Lyra Valacrest had just begun to outline the concealed flanking maneuver when the force of impact struck her side, stealing the remainder of her words and draining color from her expression. The revelation she carried dissolved into silence as her body faltered. King Calum Ardent moved before thought could restrain him. Years of battlefield conditioning taught him to prioritize formation over instinct, strategy over impulse. Yet when Lyra collapsed, that discipline fractured. He reached her before she touched the ground, catching her weight against his chest as the ridge trembled with confusion. Around them, officers struggled to re-establish clarity amid Draxmoor's disorienting tactics, but the king's focus narrowed to the Omega in his arms. The roar of the battlefield became distant, muffled beneath the thunder of a singular realization: vulnerability had found him, and it wore the face of the one person he had tried to keep far from harm. For a fraction of a second, command faltered. Soldiers watched as their sovereign abandoned the elevated position that symbolized alpha control. The sight unsettled them more than the enemy's strategy. A king did not descend from the ridge in the midst of instability. A king did not kneel. Yet Calum did both without hesitation, lowering himself to shield Lyra from further exposure as medics rushed forward. His expression did not fracture into panic, it hardened into something colder, something more dangerous. Fury rose within him. Not the blind rage of recklessness, but a sharpened resolve that stripped away every secondary concern. Despite the spreading weakness in her body, Lyra fought to remain conscious. Her hand lifted faintly, fingers tracing a subtle pattern against Calum's armored sleeve. She did not speak, yet her gaze directed him toward the eastern ridge. The warning she had attempted to deliver remained unfinished, but her intent was unmistakable. Even in pain, her mind clung to strategy. Calum followed the line of her sight and saw what his disrupted commanders had missed: a shadowed movement exploiting the sensory confusion. Understanding struck him with precision. He rose slowly, handing Lyra to the nearest medic with deliberate care, as though the battlefield itself might fracture further if he moved too abruptly. Then he reclaimed his position on the ridge. His voice, when he issued new orders, carried absolute clarity. He redirected units not by instinct, but by calculated terrain assessment, neutralizing the concealed maneuver before it could isolate the command line. Gradually, cohesion returned to Arendale's forces. What had threatened to unravel the defense was contained through adaptation rather than dominance. The enemy's psychological disruption lost momentum once the king shifted tactics beyond instinctual reliance. Victory followed not with triumphant noise, but with exhausted stabilization. Draxmoor forces retreated into the haze, their experimental strategy blunted by unexpected resilience. Yet the cost of regained control was no longer measured in territory. As reports confirmed secured perimeters and restored communication channels, Calum's attention remained fixed on the medical tent erected at the ridge's base. Tactical success meant little against the fragile rhythm of Lyra's breathing. The army had witnessed something unprecedented. They had seen their Alpha King descend from strategic elevation to carry an Omega through unstable ground, shielding her as though she were not merely a citizen, but a priority equal to command. The image embedded itself into memory more forcefully than any battlefield maneuver. Whispered conversations spread between units as dusk settled. Some spoke of impropriety, others of inevitability. The suggestion of an unspoken bond took shape not because of overt affection, but because of visible choice. Authority had yielded to attachment, and the implications were impossible to ignore. Messengers departed immediately for the capital, bearing two narratives intertwined beyond separation: decisive stabilization at Valoria Ridge and the critical injury of Lyra Valacrest. Within the marble chambers of Arendale, the Council of Elders received the news with tightly concealed alarm. Military victory secured public confidence, but the king's visible devotion introduced political volatility. Factions began recalculating alliances. an Alpha sovereign publicly aligned with an Omega outside council orchestration threatened established balance. Power structures relied on predictable hierarchy, and unpredictability now lingered at the throne's edge. Back at the encampment, Lyra drifted into unconsciousness despite the medics' measured interventions. The projectile had not stolen her life, but it had destabilized it. Calum remained just beyond the tent's threshold, refusing ceremonial distance. Advisors urged him to return to the capital to secure narrative control, to present strength before speculation took root. He declined without raising his voice. The battlefield still required leadership, and so did the uncertain rhythm within the tent. He delegated perimeter oversight to his most trusted generals, maintaining strategic vigilance while remaining physically present. As night deepened, intercepted enemy documents were delivered to Calum for review. Coded correspondences referenced a broader initiative, one aimed not at conquering territory, but at dismantling Alpha governance by exploiting emotional fracture. Draxmoor's strategy extended beyond Valoria Ridge. It sought to destabilize leadership through targeted disruption of attachment, predicting that kings would falter when confronted with vulnerability. The implication was chilling. Lyra had not been an accidental casualty. Her presence had been observed and calculated into the assault's timing. Inside the tent, the steady rhythm of Lyra's heartbeat wavered. Physicians worked in hushed coordination, their expressions disciplined yet strained. Calum stood motionless, armor still dusted with ash, crown absent from his brow. For the first time since ascending the throne, he faced a decision that no military doctrine could guide. Return to Erindale and reinforce political stability, or remain at the edge of uncertainty beside the Omega, whose mind had safeguarded his army. As Lyra's pulse flickered beneath fragile instrumentation and the weight of expectation pressed from every direction, Calum understood that whichever choice he made would redefine not only his reign, but the very foundation of the kingdom he had sworn to protect. Power demands sacrifice, but no one warned him that the sacrifice might be his own crown. The night after the battle at Valoria Ridge settled into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the low murmur of medics and the distant reshuffling of troops. Within the largest command tent, transformed now into a guarded medical chamber, King Calum Ardent stood beside Lyra Valicrest, as though the world beyond its canvas walls had ceased to exist. He had delegated battlefield oversight to his most trusted generals, issuing clear directives that maintained defensive strength without requiring his physical presence. It was the first time in his reign that he had stepped away from direct command during active conflict, and the choice carried a weight that reverberated far beyond the ridge. Messengers traveled relentlessly between the encampment and the capital, their reports sharpened by political interpretation. The Council of Elders did not receive Calum's absence with patience. In emergency assembly, they declared his extended stay at the front a destabilizing act. A king anchored to a medical tent, they argued, weakened the image of alpha dominance that held Erindale together. Whispers began circulating within noble circles that contingency plans were necessary. Alternative successors, distant relatives of the Ardent line, were quietly evaluated. No official declarations were made, yet the air within the marble halls of the capital thickened with anticipation of change. Back at Valoria Ridge, Lyra's condition deteriorated with quiet persistence. The projectile had not ended her life, but it had inflicted internal damage that even Erindale's finest battlefield physicians struggled to contain. Her breathing remained shallow, her pulse irregular. The medical team, disciplined and composed, eventually delivered their assessment with professional detachment. Survival was unlikely without advanced intervention available only within the capital's central infirmary. The words carried no dramatics, only probability. Yet probability was a language Calum had mastered on battlefields, and this was one calculation he refused to accept without challenge. Despite the strain, Calum did not relinquish strategic oversight. From a table positioned near Lyra's resting place, he reviewed terrain maps and intelligence reports. Orders were dispatched through encrypted channels, ensuring that defensive lines held firm against potential counteroffensives. His voice, when issuing directives, remained steady, betraying no hint of internal fracture. Soldiers observing him noted the duality, an alpha king maintaining composure while standing inches from personal loss. It unsettled and inspired them simultaneously. New intelligence arrived from intercepted Draxmore communications, confirming suspicions that their experimental tactics extended beyond scent disruption. Their broader objective targeted the psychological architecture of alpha leadership, seeking to exploit the instinctual bond between alphas and omegas as a vulnerability rather than strength. By destabilizing emotional anchors, they aimed to provoke rash decisions, erode authority, and fracture internal unity. Lyra's presence on the ridge had not been incidental. It had been monitored, her injury, though not explicitly ordered, aligned with a strategy designed to test whether Arindale's king would prioritize attachment over dominance. In the capital, the council seized upon this revelation as justification. They dispatched a formal communiqué demanding that Calum publicly distance himself from any personal connection to Lyra Valacrest. They framed it as a strategic necessity, insisting that clarity of hierarchy must be preserved. An alpha king entangled emotionally, they argued, would confirm Draxmore's thesis. The request was phrased diplomatically, but its implication was unmistakable: deny the bond, or risk undermining the throne. Alone in the dim light of the medical tent, Calum confronted a truth he had avoided since childhood. His upbringing had been engineered around one premise, that a king must be unbreakable because he must be unfeeling. From early adolescence, he had been trained to interpret vulnerability as weakness, attachment as liability. Tutors had replaced companions, discipline had replaced comfort. Even triumphs had been measured not in personal fulfillment, but in strategic advantage. He had ascended the throne not as a man, but as a symbol shaped by expectation. Yet standing beside Lyra, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest, he recognized the hollowness of power divorced from meaning. Authority without connection felt increasingly like performance. For a brief, fragile moment, Lyra stirred. Her eyes opened slightly, unfocused yet searching. Recognition flickered across her features before exhaustion pulled her back toward unconsciousness. The physicians responded quickly, adjusting treatments, but their conclusion remained unchanged without immediate transfer to the capital's advanced facilities. Her condition would not stabilize. The journey, however, posed immense risk. Draxmore scouts lingered near contested routes, and transporting a critically injured Omega alongside the king could invite targeted ambush. Calum listened to every objection without interruption. Political advisors urged caution, suggesting that returning alone to the capital while leaving Lyra under guarded care would preserve authority. Generals warned that movement could expose supply lines. The council's message repeated insistently in his mind: renounce attachment, reaffirm dominance, restore image. Yet none of those arguments addressed the singular reality before him. Lyra had stepped into war not for glory, but to protect the kingdom he ruled. To abandon her now would preserve optics while forfeiting integrity. By dawn, his decision crystallized. A guarded convoy would depart immediately for Arindale, utilizing secondary routes shielded by terrain and reinforced by elite units sworn to discretion. Defensive formations would accompany them, not as spectacle but as precaution. Calum would travel within the convoy, not as distant sovereign but as present protector. The announcement rippled through the encampment, solidifying loyalty among soldiers who had witnessed his choices firsthand. As the convoy approached the capital days later, tension awaited like a drawn blade. News of his return preceded him, and the council convened before the palace gates. Their reception was formal, their expressions controlled. Lyra was transferred swiftly to the central infirmary, disappearing beyond polished corridors and guarded doors. Calum, still bearing the dust of Valoria Ridge, was summoned directly into the Grand Assembly Chamber. There, beneath vaulted ceilings and the unblinking gaze of ancestral portraits, the council presented their ultimatum with chilling composure. Publicly renounce the Omega and reaffirm Alpha supremacy, or prepare to face consequences that could strip him of the throne itself. In the silent marble halls of the palace, betrayal wore the mask of loyalty. The Grand Assembly Chamber of Arindale had witnessed coronations, treaties, and declarations of war, yet the atmosphere that evening carried a different weight. The Council of Elders stood aligned beneath towering columns carved with the kingdom's victories, their robes immaculate, their expressions composed. They spoke not with raised voices but with calculated restraint, presenting their accusations as though they were acts of preservation rather than ambition. Lyra Valacrest, they argued, had destabilized the natural order. An Omega on the battlefield had disrupted hierarchy, blurred lines that centuries of governance had carefully maintained. They framed her presence not as courage but as recklessness, claiming that her proximity to command weakened Alpha authority. In their version of events, her injury symbolized the cost of abandoning tradition. The king's visible attachment, they insisted, emboldened enemies who sought to fracture Arindale from within, by allowing personal sentiment to influence strategic posture. Calum had confirmed Draxmoor's thesis that Alpha leadership could be manipulated through emotional bonds. Calum listened without interruption. He stood at the center of the chamber without crown or ceremonial mantle, having come directly from the infirmary. The absence of regalia did not diminish his presence. If anything, it sharpened it. When he finally spoke, his words carried controlled clarity. He refused to denounce Lyra's sacrifice. He recounted, without embellishment, how her strategic insight had prevented a catastrophic flanking maneuver. He reminded the council that hundreds of soldiers owed their survival to her intervention. To dismiss her contribution, he implied, would be to deny the truth in favor of convenience. The chamber grew colder as subtle fractures emerged among the elders themselves. Some maintained rigid disapproval, while others shifted uneasily. Into that tension entered new intelligence. Documents recovered from Draxmoor's retreat, decoded through relentless effort, revealed financial channels traced back to intermediaries within Arindale. The funding had supported research into psychological warfare targeting Alpha-Omega dynamics. While direct culpability was not yet proven, the implication was unmistakable. Certain council members had entertained alliances or investments that directly empowered the very tactics now condemned. The revelation did not erupt into chaos, it settled like a slow burning spark. Accusations were deflected with diplomatic precision, explanations offered in tones of offended dignity. Yet suspicion had been seeded. Calum did not exploit the moment publicly, but he observed carefully. The same voices urging him to renounce attachment had perhaps underestimated the consequences of their own maneuvering. Loyalty, it seemed, was no longer singular. Beyond the chamber's polished floors, Lyra remained unconscious within the central infirmary. Unaware of the storm gathering around her name, she lay suspended between survival and silence. Physicians worked in disciplined shifts, monitoring fragile indicators and adjusting treatment with cautious optimism. Her stillness contrasted sharply with the turbulence unfolding in governance. She had stepped into war to prevent collapse at the Ridge. Now her existence alone threatened to fracture the capital. The army's allegiance began to divide in subtle but meaningful ways. Soldiers who had witnessed the battle at Valoria Ridge spoke openly within barracks and marketplaces. They described not recklessness but resolve, recounting how Lyra had moved through confusion with deliberate strategy. They spoke of the king descending from the ridge not as weakness, but as recognition of value. Word spread beyond military circles into civilian districts. Merchants, laborers, and scholars debated whether strength must always appear detached. Public sentiment shifted gradually, like a tide turning beneath the surface. Alarmed by this change, the council accelerated its efforts. Emergency legislation was drafted under the pretense of safeguarding national stability. Provisions within the document would temporarily transfer command authority to a regency council should the king be deemed compromised by personal entanglement. The language was precise, avoiding direct accusation while constructing a framework capable of removing Calum from effective power. The throne, once the symbol of his sovereignty, began to resemble a carefully crafted cage. Within his private study, Calum reviewed the draft in silence. He recognized the strategy. It mirrored battlefield tactics he had mastered: control the narrative, isolate the target, and redefine legitimacy. Yet unlike foreign adversaries, this confrontation unfolded within his own walls. He felt no surge of anger, only clarity. The crown had always demanded obedience to expectation. Now it demanded denial of integrity. He began drafting his own document quietly, not as counterattack but as contingency. Terms of abdication took shape beneath his steady hand, outlining a transition that would preserve stability while relinquishing personal authority. Each word felt both final and liberating. He did not frame it as surrender, but as recalibration. If power required the abandonment of truth, then perhaps power itself required redefinition. The act of writing revealed something he had long suppressed. The throne's weight had grown heavier than its purpose. He paused occasionally, his thoughts drifting toward the infirmary corridors where Lyra fought an unseen battle of her own. As debate intensified within the council, a messenger arrived with urgent news from the medical wing. Lyra's condition had shifted abruptly. Indicators once stable began fluctuating unpredictably. Physicians requested immediate authorization for an experimental procedure that carried uncertain outcome. The timing tightened around Calum like a vice: political confrontation, legislative maneuvering, public opinion. All receded before the singular urgency of her survival. He set down the quill and sealed the partially completed abdication draft. The choice he faced was no longer abstract. To cling to the throne would require public renunciation of the very person who had safeguarded his forces. To relinquish it would redefine not only his reign but the kingdom's perception of strength. Outside his chamber, the council awaited response. Inside the infirmary, Lyra's life balanced on fragile probability. As footsteps echoed down the palace corridor, and physicians prepared for a decision that could not be delayed, Calum understood that the next words he spoke would echo far beyond marble walls. They would either reinforce the structure he inherited or dismantle it in pursuit of something truer. And as Lyra's condition took a sudden, perilous turn, the king prepared to make a decision that would not simply alter his rule, but reshape the destiny of Arindale itself. No battlefield had ever demanded what this moment required: the surrender of a king not to an enemy, but to loved. The sealed royal assembly convened under vaulted ceilings that had witnessed generations of alpha coronations, victories, and decrees of dominance. This time, however, the atmosphere was not charged with triumph or defiance. It carried the heavy stillness of inevitability. Nobles, council members, military commanders, and provincial delegates filled the chamber in rigid formation, their expressions guarded. At the center stood King Calum Ardent, wearing the full regalia of the Alpha throne for what would be the final time. He did not appear diminished. If anything, his composure held a clarity sharper than during wartime declarations. The Council of Elders expected negotiation, perhaps resistance. Instead, Calum delivered something far more destabilizing. He announced his formal abdication of the Alpha throne of Arindale, effective immediately upon ratification of succession protocol. For a breathless moment, silence consumed the chamber. Then a ripple of disbelief spread across the nobility, audible in hushed exhalations and restrained gasps. An Alpha King did not relinquish power voluntarily. Authority in Arindale was inherited, defended, preserved, but never surrendered. Chalem continued without hesitation. To prevent fragmentation or civil unrest, he named a temporary regent from the extended Ardent bloodline, a measured and politically neutral cousin known for administrative competence rather than ambition. The selection was strategic. It denied the council the opportunity to install one of their own while preserving continuity within the royal lineage. The regent would govern until constitutional reform could be debated openly, a clause that subtly shifted the future structure of power without immediate upheaval. His abdication address did not frame his choice as sacrifice born of weakness. Instead, he redefined strength itself. He spoke of leadership not as dominance over instinct, but as protection of those who safeguarded the kingdom's future. He acknowledged that Arindale had long equated alpha authority with emotional detachment, yet recent events had revealed a flaw in that assumption. The kingdom's survival at Valoria Ridge had depended on insight from someone the system had tried to silence. Strength, he declared, was not the absence of attachment, it was the willingness to defend it without hesitation. His words did not accuse, they illuminated. While the assembly absorbed the implications, Laura Valacrest lay within the surgical wing of the central infirmary, surrounded by the kingdom's most skilled physicians. The procedure underway carried immense risk. Internal trauma from the projectile had progressed unpredictably, and without intervention, recovery would remain impossible. Surgical teams moved with disciplined urgency, their focus absolute. Every measured decision inside chamber echoed with the knowledge that the fate of more than one life seemed suspended in its outcome. News of the abdication traveled swiftly beyond palace walls. By dusk, marketplaces and barracks alike buzzed with revelation. The former king had stepped down for an Omega who had saved their sons at Valoria Ridge. Soldiers who had witnessed the battlefield confirmed her strategic intervention. Mothers who had feared the worst for their children now viewed Lyra not as a political anomaly, but as a guardian of their families' futures. Public perception shifted dramatically. What the council had framed as weakness was increasingly understood as integrity. Simultaneously, the corruption investigation within the council accelerated. Evidence connecting certain elders to financial channels supporting Draxmoor's psychological research grew harder to dismiss. The abdication destabilized their narrative. It exposed the contrast between personal accountability and concealed ambition. Factions within governance began distancing themselves from those implicated, sensing that public tolerance for manipulation had diminished. After the assembly formally ratified the regency, Chalem removed the final symbols of his reign. The ceremonial mantle was unclasped. The signet ring placed upon the council table, the crown lifted from his brow without flourish. The act was neither dramatic nor resentful. It was deliberate. With each piece relinquished, the visual hierarchy that had defined Arindale for centuries shifted subtly. A former Alpha King stood now not as sovereign, but as citizen. He did not retreat to private quarters. Instead, he walked directly through the palace corridors toward the medical wing. Guards stepped aside instinctively, unsure how to address him. Without insignia, he carried no visible authority, yet presence alone commanded respect. Entering the infirmary as a private citizen altered more than protocol. It redefined proximity. He was no longer bound by image, no longer required to project invulnerability. He was simply Chalem Ardent, standing outside an operating chamber where Lyra's life balanced on precision and chance. The symbolism rippled through Arindale's hierarchy. If an Alpha King could relinquish absolute authority for principle, then perhaps the structure itself was not immutable. Scholars began drafting proposals for constitutional limitations. Military officers debated reforms that valued merit beyond designation. Even within the council, certainty fractured. The abdication had not weakened the kingdom, it had forced introspection. Hours stretched within the surgical wing. Chalem remained unmoving, his posture steady, but no longer armored by obligation. The weight he carried now was personal rather than ceremonial. Outside the palace, citizens gathered quietly, awaiting updates. For the first time in generations, the future of Arendelle did not hinge solely on conquest or dominance, but on the survival of a woman who had dared to step into war. At last, the operating chamber doors opened. Physicians emerged with expressions carefully neutral, their silence prolonging collective suspense. In that suspended moment, no title, no crown, no decree could alter what came next, and as the verdict hovered unspoken in the charged air of the infirmary corridor, Arendelle faced the haunting question that no battlefield had prepared it for, whether the king's sacrifice had secured redemption, or whether it had arrived one heartbeat too late. Sometimes revolutions do not begin with swords, they begin with a single heartbeat returning. The silence outside the surgical wing stretched so long that it felt permanent. Physicians had stepped through the doors with expressions trained into neutrality, and for several suspended seconds, no one moved. Then the lead surgeon delivered the verdict with measured composure. Lyra Valacrest had survived the procedure. The complications had been contained. Recovery would be long and uncertain, but survival was no longer theoretical. The words moved through the corridor like a spark finding dry timber. Chalem did not collapse with relief. He exhaled once slowly, as though releasing a weight he had carried since Valoria Ridge. For the first time since the shot fractured the battlefield, probabilities shifted in her favor. That shift, quiet and clinical within the infirmary walls, would soon reshape the capital itself. News traveled faster than any formal decree. By morning, Arendelle knew. The Omega who had stepped into war, and the king who had stepped away from a throne, were no longer suspended in tragedy. They had endured. Citizens gathered outside the palace gates not in protest, but in expectation. Merchants closed their shops early. Veterans stood in uniform along the outer steps. Students from the academies arrived carrying parchment signs inscribed with words that had rarely been spoken aloud in public reform: balanced, representation. The atmosphere was not chaotic, it was resolute. Within the barracks, soldiers spoke openly of Valoria Ridge. They did not recount it as a tale of chaos, but of clarity. They described Lyra's composure amid confusion and Chalem's decision to adapt rather than cling to instinct. Loyalty began shifting, not away from the crown, but toward the ideals demonstrated during crisis. It was no longer blind allegiance to hierarchy. It was allegiance to integrity. Officers quietly pledged that they would serve the kingdom's stability, not the political insulation of compromised elders. When Lyra finally opened her eyes fully days later, the room felt unfamiliar in its stillness. Recovery confined her physically, but awareness returned with sharp focus. She asked first about the ridge, then about the soldiers. Only after assurances of stabilized borders did she inquire about Chalem. The truth was delivered carefully. He had abdicated. He had relinquished the Alpha throne to protect both her life and the kingdom's moral foundation. The knowledge settled over her not as burden, but as gravity. She understood immediately what his choice meant in the architecture of Arendelle. An Alpha king surrendering power for principle did not merely disrupt tradition, it exposed its fragility. She requested updates on governance, and though physicians urged rest, her mind began assembling connections. Survival had granted her something unexpected, not just life, but leverage. Meanwhile, political trials commenced within the Grand Judicial Chamber. Evidence linking certain council members to covert financial channels supporting Draxmoor's psychological operations was presented with meticulous documentation. Correspondence revealed calculated investments in research designed to destabilize Alpha, Omega bonds, framed as experimental deterrents but executed without transparency. The proceedings were not spectacles. They were methodical dismantlings of credibility. For the first time in generations, The council was forced to answer rather than command. As testimonies unfolded, Arundale's rigid caste assumptions began to fracture under scrutiny. Scholars questioned long-held doctrines that equated alpha leadership with inherent superiority. Beta spoke openly of administrative contributions historically minimized. Omegas, long confined to ceremonial roles, found their experiences reframed through Lyra's example. She had not disrupted order, she had preserved it. The narrative shifted from containment to inclusion. Lyra, though physically weakened, requested the presence of legal advisors and reform advocates. From her recovery chamber, she outlined proposals not as rebellion but as structural refinement. She suggested the formation of a strategic council inclusive of all designations, emphasizing merit-based appointment rather than hereditary exclusivity. She advocated for codified limitations on emergency powers to prevent manipulation under the guise of stability. Her approach was not emotional retaliation, it was calculated reconstruction. Those who met with her left with the distinct impression that the kingdom's future was being redesigned from a hospital bed. Public assemblies outside the palace grew larger, yet remained disciplined. Citizens called not for chaos, but for constitutional debate. They requested representation in governance proportional to contribution. The regent, recognizing the tide of sentiment, authorized preliminary forums for discussion rather than suppressing them. The decision prevented escalation and signaled cautious acknowledgement that Arundale was changing. Throughout these developments, offers arrived at Chalem's private residence urging reinstatement. Military commanders, provincial leaders, even foreign dignitaries suggested that the throne awaited his return. Stability, they argued, required the certainty of his authority. Yet Chalem declined each proposal without bitterness. He had not abdicated to provoke sympathy or consolidate admiration. He had stepped down because power unexamined had become distortion. To resume it without reform would negate the clarity his choice had revealed. He visited Lyra quietly during her recovery, not as king but as presence. Their conversations remained measured, focused less on personal sacrifice and more on the trajectory unfolding beyond palace walls. He listened as she described structural adjustments and potential resistance points. She observed that transformation required continuity as much as disruption. Neither framed the future as restoration of what had been. They spoke instead of recalibration. As weeks passed, the trials concluded with formal removals of implicated elders. Interim appointments emphasized transparency. Committees began drafting revisions to governance charters that had remained untouched for centuries. The rigid architecture of caste authority no longer appeared invulnerable. It was being reconsidered line by line, yet uncertainty lingered. Reform movements often faltered without enduring leadership, and the nation's collective gaze gradually returned to Chalem. He stood outside the throne's shadow, neither reclaiming nor rejecting influence. His restraint unsettled some and inspired others. The kingdom had witnessed abdication. Now it wondered what form leadership might take if divorced from inherited dominance. Arundale stood at the edge of transformation, its foundations shifting not through conquest, but through introspection. Citizens awaited the next declaration, not from a crowned sovereign, but from a former king who had redefined strength once already. And as the capital held its breath beneath banners no longer unquestioned, one question echoed through marble corridors and crowded squares alike. Would Chalem Ardent rise again, not as ruler, but as something greater than a throne had ever allowed him to be? The greatest power was never the throne, it was the freedom to choose who one becomes after losing everything. Arundale did not transform overnight, nor did it descend into chaos after the abdication. Instead, it entered a season of deliberate reconstruction. The regency held steady while constitutional revisions moved from proposal to ratification. Public assemblies evolved into structured forums, and debates once whispered behind closed doors were conducted beneath open arches in the capital square. The absence of an absolute alpha monarch did not fracture the kingdom. It revealed the resilience that had always existed beneath ceremonial dominance. When the newly drafted constitutional charter was finalized, it formalized a separation of symbolic monarchy and executive governance. The throne would remain as cultural continuity, but unchecked authority would not. Executive military oversight would be granted to a role defined not by bloodline, but by demonstrated leadership. It was then that Calum Ardent accepted a position that surprised no one and yet altered everything: Protector General of Arundel. The title carried no crown, no hereditary privilege. It was an appointed office ratified by both the regent and the newly formed Civic Council. As Protector General, Calum oversaw national defense and strategic security, accountable to constitutional review rather than absolute decree. The symbolism was unmistakable. The former Alpha King did not reclaim sovereignty. He accepted responsibility within boundaries shaped by collective consent. His authority now flowed from trust, not tradition. Lyra Valicrest, having regained her strength through months of disciplined recovery, was appointed Strategic Chancellor. The position did not exist prior to reform. It was created to formalize what had already been proven at Valoria Ridge, that strategic insight could not be confined by designation. As Chancellor, she chaired the Cross Designation Advisory Council, integrating alphas, betas, and omegas into governance processes that had once excluded them. Her influence was not ceremonial. It shaped policy, supply logistics, diplomatic outreach, and military preparedness. One of the earliest reforms addressed the very tactic Draxmore had exploited. Military research divisions dismantled scent-based hierarchy dependency protocols, retraining units to rely on cognitive coordination rather than instinctual dominance structures. Command of systems were redesigned to prevent psychological manipulation rooted in designation. Training academies revised curricula to emphasize adaptive strategy over inherited superiority. The reform did not erase biological identity. It recontextualized it. Strength was no longer measured by intensity of instinct, but by discipline of thought. Across the border, Draxmore faced internal destabilization. Their investment in psychological warfare had fractured trust within their own leadership ranks. Revelations of covert experimentation and financial mismanagement triggered dissent among their provinces. Without the anticipated collapse of Arundel, their strategy unraveled. Within a year of Valoria Ridge, Draxmore formally sued for peace, proposing demilitarized zones and trade normalization. Arundel accepted the treaty not as conquest, but as closure. The bond between Calum and Lyra matured under public scrutiny. Yet it was no longer interpreted through dominance narratives. Their partnership symbolized recalibrated balance. They were not king and consort. They were protector, general and chancellor, operating within distinct roles that intersected through mutual respect. Public perception shifted from curiosity to affirmation. Young cadets cited their example in academy essays. Civic leaders referenced their collaboration during reform debates. The kingdom no longer feared the visibility of attachment. It recognized its stabilizing force when aligned with integrity. Arundel evolved gradually into a society that valued designation without weaponizing it. Omegas entered administrative training programs in record numbers. Betas assumed greater strategic planning roles within defense councils. Alphas, freed from the expectation of emotional suppression, demonstrated leadership through mentorship rather than intimidation. The hierarchy that once defined identity softened into structure without rigidity. Valoria Ridge, once remembered only for tactical engagement, was designated a memorial site. A circular monument now stood where Lyra had fallen, engraved not with titles, but with the names of soldiers saved during that campaign. At its center, an inscription read, "Strength is the courage to protect what gives life meaning." Each year, citizens gathered there not to glorify battle, but to reflect on transformation. The memorial did not celebrate injury, it honored awakening. Historians began reframing the abdication not as scandal, but as revolution. Academic texts described it as the pivotal moment when Arundel transitioned from inherited dominance to constitutional equilibrium. Scholars debated whether the kingdom had been poised for change long before the shot at Valoria Ridge, or whether it required that singular fracture to expose systemic flaws. Regardless of interpretation, consensus emerged around one truth: the surrender of the crown had preserved the nation's moral core. Calum often visited the ridge alone at dusk, no escort, no ceremony. He stood where command had once defined him and reflected on the path from sovereign to servant leader. He did not regret the throne. He simply no longer required it. Lyra joined him there on the anniversary of her recovery, the wind gentler now than it had been during war. Together they observed the horizon that had once signaled threat and now suggested possibility. Peace settled across Arundel with a quiet steadiness. Trade routes reopened. Education reforms expanded beyond the capital. Diplomatic envoys carried the kingdom's revised charter abroad as a model of adaptive governance. Yet neither Calum nor Lyra mistook stability for permanence. History had taught them that complacency invited fracture. A kingdom built on choice required vigilance not against enemies alone, but against erosion of principle. As the sun dipped beyond distant hills and shadows lengthened across the memorial stone, a subtle unease lingered at the edge of the horizon. Destiny rarely announced itself with clarity. It approached in whispers, in unforeseen trials that tested whether conviction could withstand comfort. And as Arundel stood renewed beneath banners no longer bound to absolute rule, a quiet question stirred within its reborn foundations. When the next storm gathered beyond sight, would a kingdom forged in choice prove stronger than one forged in fear? Arundel was not saved by power, nor by tradition, but by a choice that defied both. An Omega who refused to stay hidden, and a king who refused to stay untouchable reshaped an empire that had feared its own heart. The crown was surrendered, but strength was not. It was redefined. Where dominance once ruled, balance began to rise, and in the echo of one battlefield decision, a new legacy was born, one built not on hierarchy, but on courage. If this story challenged the way you see power, loyalty, and love, don't let it end here. Pass it to someone who believes strength is more than a title. Stories like this grow when sharp minds discuss them, so keep the conversation alive and stay close for what's coming next. Because the next empire we break down might change the way you see leadership forever. Now tell me, if you had to choose between power and principle, which would you protect? And before you go, which country are you watching this from right now?